Our second speaker this afternoon is Dr. Michael Gorn. He received his doctorate in history in 1978 from the University of Southern California. He has served as Deputy Air Force Historian and later as the first historian of the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency in Washington. Since 1996, he's been employed by the National Aeronautics and Space Administration and is presently the chief historian of the NASA Dryden Flight Research Center in Edwards, California. Gorn is the author of a number of books about aeronautics and space flight, most recently with Richard P. Hallian, On the Frontier, Experimental Flight at NASA Dryden. That was published by Smithsonian Institution Press in 2003. He has also published Expanding the Envelope, Flight Research at NACA and NASA. That was published by the University Press of Kentucky in 2001, and The Universal Man, Theodore von Karman's Life in Aeronautics, published by Smithsonian Institution Press in 1992. He is the former co-editor of the Smithsonian History of Aviation book series. Dr. Gorn serves presently on the History and Education Committee of the U.S. Centennial of Flight Commission.
I'd like to talk to you today about an extraordinary person named Hugh L. Dryden. And his picture is over here on the top right. And what I want to get across to you is a little bit about his influence on aeronautics and spaceflight, but also that the image we have of Dryden, for those of us who are aware of him, is somewhat of a flawed image, somewhat out of character with Dryden himself. So let me begin without any delay. There are three reasons why I think Dryden is an important person to know. One is that he knew virtually everyone in the field of aeronautics and spaceflight, worth knowing. Budgeteers, engineers, politicians, and he not only knew them, but he had the kind of personality, as I'll explain to you later, that could act as a conduit, an open conduit between all these different people in the complex of aerospace. And ideas sifted back and forth through his mind all over the world. He was a very effective conduit. Secondly, he was a first-rate researcher in his own right. In the early 1920s, he researched the field of compressibility, the compressing of air as an object approaches the speed of sound. He did this with Lyman Briggs of the National Bureau of Standards at a time when speed racers were going 200 miles an hour at most. Was looking ahead to transonic flight and even supersonic flight. And finally, Dryden represents one of the rare bridges between the very earliest days of aeronautics and spaceflight. When Dryden was young in aeronautics, Curtis Jennings were the frontline fighter. Most of the infrastructure that came to be associated with air and space simply didn't exist. By the time of his death in 1965, the space shuttle, the supersonic transport, even the F-15 and F-16 fighters were, if not on the drawing board, certainly in the early conceptual phases. So he's one of these rare people by accident of birth whose life brackets most of the important events of aerospace in the 20th century. But I'd like to begin by showing you, I'd like to tell you today about Dryden through 15 photographs that I have that his family has loaned to me for the biography I'm working on about him. And you see, both here and up there, a standard image of Dryden. And it's an image that, rather than, I think, illuminating him, sort of holds the viewer off. It's, in a way, a picture that prevents you from getting to know him. And I think the subsequent pictures will show what I mean. There's a kind of opaqueness, there's a kind of remoteness to him. And if I could have the next image, please. The image on the right was taken in 1910 when Dryden was 12 years old. And if you can tell from left to right, he is the first row middle. This was taken at the graduating class of the Chase Intermediate School in Baltimore, Maryland. And he was top in his class. He was 3 years younger than everyone else. He was only 12 years of age, graduating from intermediate school. And he showed this precociousness all along in his education. There was no eminence in the Dryden family. They emigrated from Scotland in the late 17th century for reasons of religious persecution. They settled for the most part along the Pocomoke River in Maryland, and they were mostly farmers and tradesmen. Dryden's father was different. He had apparently real aptitude for mathematics, perhaps brilliance, but at the same time he was hot-tempered. He began as a teacher, but sank his own career, perhaps because of his hot temper, ended up opening a general store in southern Maryland at a tiny crossroads, went out of business during the panic of 1907, and ended up finally moving to Baltimore as a streetcar conductor for the rest of his life. Dryden's mother, by contrast, was a soft-spoken, discerning, inward sort of woman, and Hugh Dryden owes much of his appearance to her. In fact, the resemblance is startling. And Dryden is very much equal parts of the two people. Next, please. This picture makes Dryden look like he's a member of the leisure class, but he was anything but that, particularly, again, because his father was a streetcar conductor and the family just had enough to get by on in Baltimore. It's taken around 1912 or 13, when he was 14 or 15 years of age, graduating from the best high school in Baltimore, known as Baltimore City College. He graduated again first in his class, won the mathematics prize, but at the same time, despite the image that you see in front of you, he had to work very hard outside of his class, outside of his studies. He worked in a canning factory, he delivered the Baltimore Sun paper, worked in the United Biscuit Company on the assembly line, all to add income to the family. Next, please. And here is Dryden, the college man. His friend is singing from, I don't know how well you can see it, but it's a World War I song, Goodbye, Good Luck, God Bless You, and Dryden is trying it out on the mandolin there. Dryden appears to be a very serious picture, particularly from these two images left on the side screens and this one up here. In fact, as you'll see, he was not so serious as he appears to be. This is taken in 1916 when he was 18 years old. He received his undergraduate degree from Johns Hopkins University in Baltimore on full scholarship and entered with advanced standing when he was 15 years of age. He got his undergraduate degree in mathematics, stayed on to study with Joseph Ames in the physics department in applied physics. Ames was one of the great physics synthesizers of the 19th and 20th century and went on to very important positions as president of Johns Hopkins University, as chairman of the NACA, which organization you've heard a great deal about this morning. And NASA Ames, of course, is named for him in Northern California. Next, please. Here is a picture of Hugh Dryden as doctoral student. He was about 20 years old in this picture, taken in 1919. He, as far as I know, he's the youngest person to receive a doctorate from Johns Hopkins University. He was 20 years old when he received it in applied physics. Before he received the doctorate, when he was working on his master's degree, Ames won a position for him at the National Bureau of Standards as a munitions gauge inspector during World War I. And Dryden then stayed at the Bureau for 29 years, very gradually rising in authority. He did his dissertation, by the way, on the scaling effects of air flowing around columns, a classical aerodynamics thesis. Next, please. And I'd like to call your attention to this picture of Hugh Dryden as family man. The infant is Hugh Jr., taken just after his birth, of course, and that's his wife, Libby Travers Dryden. They met when they were teenagers in the Appold Methodist Church in Baltimore, Maryland. And I think if you look at the picture, you can see the difference between the two of them. If you'll notice, Dryden is standing with his feet very close together, and he's quite compressed the way he stands. And Libby Dryden is standing with her feet apart and very open. And she was just what she appears. She was earthy and friendly and open. Dryden was not cold, but he was reserved and ascetic and introverted, thoughtful. And it was a long and happy marriage. I think the thing also I want to emphasize at this picture is the Methodism. Dryden was a devout Methodist. In fact, he actually wanted to go to Methodist seminary before he wanted to go to Johns Hopkins. But he entered Hopkins, as I said, when he was 15, and no seminary would take 15-year-olds. So he was deflected from doing that. But he remained a Methodist lay minister his entire life. The NASA headquarters history office has dozens of his sermons, and they were, many of them, quite beautiful sermons, and they became more intense and more spiritual as his life went along. Next, please. This is my favorite picture of the lot. It shows the Drydens in 1935 in Atlantic City, New Jersey, on the boardwalk. And Libby, of course, on the left, and next to her is Mary Ruth, and next to her is Hugh Jr., who you saw as an infant in the last picture. This is a long jump in time. It's 12 years jump in time. And Hugh Dryden, by this time Dryden had become a person of some consequence. And that's for a number of reasons, just giving you the very briefest reason why. He had become, shortly after he joined the Bureau of Standards, he'd become head of the Bureau's aerodynamics section, in charge of a new wind tunnel that they had. After he did his compressibility research in the early 1920s, which gained him a great deal of notice, he added to this with an even more important discovery, which is part technological and part scientific. He took an anemometer and made a hot wire anemometer out of it, and the way he was able to do it was he was able to measure very minute variations in airflow in wind tunnels, and he applied that not only to his tunnel at the Bureau of Standards, but it became widely used all over the United States. Dryden then took that and was able to verify Ludwig Prandtl's 1907 boundary layer theory in, I think, 1928 or 29, and that was the thing that really made Dryden's scientific reputation. At the same time, in 1934, he advanced in the bureaucracy as chief of the Mechanics and Sound Division at the Bureau of Standards. Next, please. This was Hugh Dryden's home, this little row house, from roughly 1922 until 1958. So he and Libby spent most of their married life there. And I want to call your attention to the modesty of the house. It overlooked Rock Creek Park, which, for people who are in the Washington, D.C. area, is this beautiful long park that runs through Maryland and down into the District of Columbia. But it's a very modest, small house in which he raised his children, at least his first two children. And I think it's important to recognize that as he advanced in his career, he made the decision to stay here. And I think it reflects something about Dryden, that he's a very modest person, not very interested in particularly how he was perceived in the sense of his own intelligence, his own standing, and that sort of thing. And bear in mind, he stayed in this house when he became chief scientist of the Bureau of Standards, director of the pivotal Bat Missile Project during World War II, became known throughout the world through his connection in part with the great Theodore von Karman, known in international scientific circles, finally became the associate director of the Bureau of Standards, and then director of the NACA in 1947, and he remained here that whole time. Next, please. And I think if we're going to look at a standard picture of Dryden or an official portrait, I think the one on the right in these side panels here is closer to it. I think it shows a little bit more of his characteristics of intelligence and determination and discernment. And it's important to remember with Dryden that by the time he became chairman of the NACA in September 1947, when this picture was taken, for the next 18 years, between that job and when he became deputy director of the deputy administrator of NASA, he was one of the very few people who actually set the nation's agenda on aerospace development. one of the very few government officials, particularly civilian officials, who had a tremendous impact on where federal money was spent to encourage research. Now, his predecessor, George Lewis, for whom this great laboratory here in Cleveland was named until recently, although it's still Lewis Field, of course, he and Dryden are very different people. Lewis was affable and friendly and jovial and clubby and chummy and all those things. Dryden, as I've said before, was quiet, friendly in his own way, affable in a quiet kind of way, but entirely different from Lewis. And most importantly, he took the NACA in a far different direction. From the very first month, from this month, that this picture was taken, he took the NACA in the direction of high-speed flight, hypersonics, and eventually even space flight. Next, please. I think this image shows Dryden as he was at meetings and conferences and so on. It isn't this very serious, kind of forbidding-looking character or this Mr. Magoo character to the left of that image. He smiled easily. He got along very easily and well with people. He understood bureaucracy exceedingly well and knew how to work it very well. And he would have been a pleasure to be around, I think, in a quiet sort of way. And I have to let you in on a secret about Hugh Dryden midway through this or farther in. His daughter told me that he absolutely detested having his picture taken. And that's one of the reasons that this is the Dryden that's come down to us rather than the candid picture of Dryden. And it changes entirely the way we look at him, I think. Next, please. This is a picture at a dinner, I think in 1960, of Hugh Dryden and the great Theodore von Karman. Karman gesturing there with a dark suit. And Karman loved to hold court. He and Dryden were very close friends, about as good of friends as any two scientists I've ever read about, collaborated enormously. But the expression on Dryden's face is interesting, and I think it reveals a lot about him. Much as he and von Karman admired and respected each other, Dryden just did not like showiness, and he didn't like display. And I think even with his great friend von Karman, he just kind of sat and kept his own thoughts. And I think this picture tells you a lot about the sort of the inner mind of Hugh Dryden. Next, please. This picture is taken in Tokyo in 1962, and this is Professor Kaneshigi, whom Dryden is shaking hands with. You can see in the picture that Dryden physically does not look as well as he had in the other pictures. He was diagnosed with lung cancer in 1962 and had extensive surgery. He wasn't a smoker, but his secretary thinks that it was the many meetings he was in, small closed meetings with many smokers, might have contracted it that way. During this, just before this period, the few years before this period, Dryden had a very great disappointment that I don't think is very well known. When NASA was formed in October 1958, Dryden was convinced that he would be named the first administrator, so much so that he had asked Guy Stever, who eventually became President Nixon's science advisor, to be his deputy. So his daughter told me also it was a bitter disappointment for him when he wasn't named, and instead Keith Glennon of Case Western Reserve was named first administrator. But Dryden, I think, and this says a lot about Dryden, at Glennon's urging, in fact, Glennon would not take the job unless Dryden stayed on as his deputy. Dryden agreed to stay on, and he was a very important part of the early NASA in forming Mercury, Gemini, and Apollo. And despite the illness that he was not able to shake off, but rather live with for a few years, he worked, as his calendars show that are kept in the NASA History Office, he worked, if anything, a more punishing work schedule as the years went on, as the space program accelerated. Next, please. And here, of course, is President Eisenhower. Dryden, with his back to the camera, is introducing his daughter, Nancy, who came later in life, and there's Libby Dryden between them. Dryden eventually became, if not a fixture at the White House, a frequent visitor to the White House from the Mercury program onwards. And that's because both Glennon and his successor, James Webb, relied on Dryden's technical knowledge and brought him often to the White House. In fact, the calendars show that he often went himself to the White House in later years to advise, beginning with President Eisenhower and then subsequent presidents, about budgets, how to form the program. And this worked both up and down with Dryden. He advised the presidents and, of course, President Johnson. But he also spent most of his days advising his staff, the people who worked, who were subordinates of his, about how these very complex, technologically challenging programs should be organized. And Dryden, as I said, had gotten tremendous bureaucratic and budgeteering instincts through his years at the Bureau of Standards and as director of the NACA. Next, please. This is a picture of Dryden, I think, as he would have looked in his office, and that was his office, toward the last couple of years of his life. Quite thin, but also relaxed and quite affable and quite friendly, in fact. And surprisingly, in the last 3 years of his life, this very modest, reserved person became something of a celebrity because of the space program. He was on Meet the Press and Face the Nation quite frequently. In his files at NASA headquarters are letters from school children, writing for an autographed picture. And I always thought this was a case to show that if you live long enough, life would bring things you never would have expected to you, to this otherwise quite anonymous person. Next, please. This photograph was taken 6 days before President Kennedy's assassination. And that's Air Force One in the background. Dryden's back to the camera. James Webb's profile between Dryden and Kennedy. And it makes the point I suppose I've already made, and that is that in the Kennedy administration as well, Dryden was a very frequent visitor to the White House. He was involved deeply in the decision about Apollo, especially with President Johnson. He and President Johnson, when Johnson was a senator, had differences, partly because Johnson did not want Dryden to run NASA when it was formed. But the differences, I think, passed away in time, and by the time Johnson had become vice president and Dryden was deputy administrator of NASA, they respected each other very much, and Johnson often called on Dryden for advice about how the manned space, how the Apollo program should be established. And I might add that Nancy Dryden said the only time that she saw her father in an emotional state was at Kennedy's assassination. Next, please. This is the final picture I wanted to show you, and it was taken of Hugh Dryden in his hospital at Bethesda Naval, his hospital room at Bethesda Naval Hospital in 3 weeks before his death, in November, around Thanksgiving, 1965, and he's holding his grandson. And I think it's important to compare these two pictures. The one picture is the standard picture of Hugh Dryden, and I think the other picture shows a great deal more about him. On his death in December 1965, President Johnson, who, as I said, had become a strong admirer of his and a close ally, actually, said that no soldier ever performed his duty with more bravery than Hugh Dryden. Whenever the first American spaceman sets foot on the moon or finds a new trail to a new star, he will know that Hugh Dryden was one of those who gave him knowledge and illumination. And finally, 10 years later, in 1976, then Administrator James Fletcher went out to what's now NASA Dryden in California and dedicated the center to him, and it's still dedicated to Dryden. And Fletcher said, "It is most fitting that this Flight Research Center, with its unique and highly specialized capability for solving aerospace problems, should memorialize the genius of Hugh Dryden." Well, thank you very much.